On 22nd of May 1915, a train carrying 485 soldiers of the Royal Scots Battalion, destined for Liverpool and onwards transport to the front lines in Gallipoli, crashed into a stationary local passenger train sitting on the tracks at Quintinshill signal box near Gretna Green in the Scottish borders. The local passenger train should have been moved to a siding in order to allow the faster troop train to pass, but due to the actions of one signal man that day, 240 soldiers were to lose their lives in horrific fashion. The resulting investigations uncovered a series of human errors behind the accident, which was and remains the worst rail disaster in British history. If you'd like to begin your talk, Louise.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, the most calamitous railway disaster in the history of Great Britain. And it happened on a sunny Saturday morning in May 1915 and claimed the lives of a lot of people. There were also other people involved as well as the 214 soldiers. And yes, it remains the worst rail disaster in British history to this day. So, to set the scene, this is May 1915. It's less than a year after the start of the war, and the war's got bogged down in the trenches of northern France and Flanders. 9th of May, heavy casualties were sustained at Aubers Ridge. There was failure to make gains, and it was blamed on the shortage of shells. British soldiers died last week on Aubers Ridge because the British Army is short of shells, according to Commander-in-Chief Sir John French. And the Times newspaper took up the story. It was a national scandal, putting Asquith's government into crisis. David Lloyd George was appointed as the Minister of Munitions with the whole intention of ramping up shell production. And the map here on the right is HM Gretna, which was a purpose-built munitions factory. It was a vast complex township that was constructed. It's actually very close to the crash site at Quintinshill. So also, at the same time, Churchill's plan to break the deadlock by landing troops at Gallipoli possibly wasn't going quite as he planned. So, all in all, May 1915, things were not going that well. And then, on top of it, this happens. So, there we go. So, on that Saturday morning, early, Thomas Straight and his grandfather had left their house near the railway line. And when they were walking along to work, they were met by a man running along the road, man frantically waving a red flag. So Thomas's grandfather shouts, "What's the matter this morning up the Cali?" Cali, the Caledonian Railway. And the reply came, "There's been a terrible accident. A troop train has run into a passenger train, and an express train has run into both of them. There's debris all over the track, and there's bound to be dozens killed." So Thomas's grandfather heads off to Gretna as quick as he can to try and notify authorities and help out. And Thomas runs onto the crash site at Quintinshill. So the location at Quintinshill, as you can see, it's pretty rural, on very close to the border, England and Scotland. Gretna Green here, and that's just north of Carlisle. And the troops of the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots had actually been raised in Leith, Portobello, and Musselburgh, which are very north sort of boroughs of Edinburgh, onto the Firth of Forth here. And the second red dot there is a place called Larbert, and that is near where they were training at the time. And this is where they boarded the train on that fateful journey, on that fateful morning. It was 485 soldiers on there. These were A and D Company. C and B Company were actually put on a different train, which fortunately for them went nowhere near this crash site. So Quintinshill signal box itself, this is it. It's no longer there. The red dot marks where it formerly stood. And this controlled these two what are called loops or sidings. The purpose of these were for moving slower trains out of the way, off the main lines, so faster trains could go past. And this was wartime, so there was immense pressure on the railways, moving men, moving everything by railway and that and canal. Coastal transport by ship was slightly tricky at the moment because of the U-boat threat. So railways were mainly used, and the signal box was to control the flow of these railways. Holding up express trains and troop trains was a no-no, so they had to get slower trains off the track. With the pressure on the railways, increased number of trains, this required very, very careful management and competent management. So the stock itself, the trains themselves, these are fairly modern locomotive engines. I won't go into all their details, which ones were pulling which, but they were good quality. There was nothing wrong with those. Very fast express trains, relatively speaking now. But due to wartime pressures, for the other trains on the track, it was a case of basically anything on wheels did the job. They were old slow freight trains, frequently broke down and held other trains up and clogged up the tracks. These are forever immortalized as the troublesome trucks in Thomas Tank Engine stories, if you're familiar with those. That's where their origin came from. And they were indeed pretty troublesome for everyone. The carriages that the troops of the Royal Scots were travelling in were these wooden carriages. The train was made up of 15 of these. These were ancient, they were obsolete, but had been hauled out of retirement to make up for wartime shortages. They were pulled by the newer engines. So you've got very old carriages pulled by newer engines. So when they were pulled along, they'd be shaking and luggage would fall from racks. So quite a nerve-wracking experience in itself. And this one here, this carriage here, it was a replica that was built for the commemorations. I think it was the 100-year commemorations. And that's in Leith, by the War Memorial in Leith. And of probably a bit of significance is the method of lighting these carriages. That was through compressed gas canisters are on there, and that will come obvious a bit later. So just quickly to go through what happened. I mean, I'll let this animation run first of all. I'll come back to this in more detail a bit later. Okay, when it starts again, there you have the local train coming in. It can't go into that loop because, sorry, it can't go into that loop because it's already a freight train. So it's shunted onto this opposite track and troop train goes into it. Express train goes into that. But I'll go through all of that in a bit more detail. I wasn't sure if my animation was going to work, so I actually broke it down in case I had to talk everyone through it. I wasn't too sure the animation was going to work on this, but fortunately it has. But when young Thomas Straighton reached the crash site to help out, he was just met with the worst possible situation, worst imaginable. 3 trains were piled up. And the noise was such that when the impact actually happened, a local woman thought the Germans had invaded. It was just, the noise was just deafening. The troop train of these 15 old wooden carriages had concertinaed on themselves. So the train was half the length that it set out as. And many, many men were trapped in amongst the wreckage of that. And if this wasn't quite bad enough, these compressed gas cylinders started to leak. and they were ignited by sparks from the embers from the coal-powered locomotives. So soon, everything was, it was just a massive inferno that spread to all 5 trains on the track. And on top of that, there was a small amount of ammunition that cooked off as well, just to add to it. And in amongst all of that, men were trapped. And when I first heard about this story and heard about, types of statements like that, I kind of men killing themselves rather than burn alive, or begging their officers to shoot them, put them out of their misery. I kind of thought that was apocryphal, but the more reading it, actually, I think, yeah, this did happen, sadly, very, very sadly. There are corroborating accounts. So locals like young Thomas were the first on the scene, farmers, and they did their best to help the trapped soldiers, but there was very little they could do. They just had farm implements to try and free them. What they really needed was water, and there was absolutely none to be found. So, yeah, they just did their best. And it was actually some time before the first rescue train appeared from Carlisle, which contained medics and firemen. And the doctors were freeing men by carrying out amputations under really dangerous conditions. And it was really awful. The injured were laid out and attended in fields by volunteers and helpers before they were taken to Carlisle to hospital. There were so many. The hospital Carlisle, they ran out of stretchers, so anything had to be repurposed, like ladders and planks of wood, that sort of thing. One observer said the hospital seemed more like a hospital on the front line of the battle rather than just a local town hospital at the time. The dead were put in a barn which acted as a temporary morgue. Excuse me. And by mid-morning, there was absolutely no hope of any more survivors. As news started to filter through what had happened, the authorities put on trains to bring relatives from Edinburgh down to Carlisle to see their loved ones in hospital, but they were told not to travel unless they had been notified that their loved ones had actually been found and were alive. Numbers a wee bit sketchy, but approximately 30, 40 men were eventually rounded up for roll call, and that was all that was left of those who could still walk and still at least physically uninjured. The passenger manifest for the battalion was actually on board, so that was incinerated. So there's a wee bit of confusion over numbers and who was where to start with. And the treatment of these survivors was, it was pretty callous by today's standards. They were just put on the train. They were put on a train to Carlisle, where they were allowed to wash and given some food, and then they were put back on a train to Liverpool. They were going to Gallipoli. So off they went on a train, which must have been a terrifying experience after what they had just been through. When they got to Liverpool, they had to sort out all their kits. And at least one of them recorded that he thought that there was flesh stuck on his kit bag. So, yeah, eventually there was a sort of level of common sense, and only 7 officers actually ended up going to Gallipoli out of the 485 who'd started out that morning. The rest who went to Liverpool were then put on another train and taken back up to Edinburgh to hospital. So I think, given their trauma, they were probably pretty sick of train travel by that end of that day. The wreckage was pretty quickly cleared away. You couldn't hold up any trains. Will nobody think of the shareholders of the railways? But And it would also attracted sightseers and souvenir hunters of the worst type. So, yeah, thank goodness there are no mobile phones in that era, but they cleared it very, very quickly and got things moving. The dead, such as could be found, were taken to Edinburgh, and they're buried in this mass grave. It's a mass grave at Rosebank Churchyard Rosebank Cemetery in Leith, because so many of the bodies were unidentifiable and many weren't actually found. So it's just one big mass grave with the names on the plaque. So immediately answers were sought. What had caused this? I mean, these are the front pages of newspapers. Gas on trains is more deadly than the German poison fumes is one of them. So in the true tradition of tabloid newspapers, they were looking for answers. And soon enough, in the search for answers, the spotlight fell on these two. George Meakin and James Tinsley, signalmen on duty at the time of the crash. Yeah. So to go through their part in the crash and what happened, I've broken down that earlier graphic. So you have Quintinshill box, the signal box here in pink. And excuse me, what happened was at 6 a.m., Meakin is supposed to clock off work. He's done the night shift. Tinsley's supposed to start. Tinsley's late. He was late, more than half an hour late. And this was a little unofficial agreement that the two of them had, which was obviously contravening regulations. In the time between when Tinsley should have started and he actually started, the northbound freight train had been moved, this blue train had been moved into a loop to allow faster trains to go past. And then the London to Glasgow Express passes through without incident. At that point, the local train's heading in to Quintinshill Junction, and a coal train is heading south with the troop train behind it. So at 6:32, Tinsley gets off the local train, which is another contravention of regulations. He's not supposed to do that. And he actually clocks in at 6:35. All train movements had to be logged in a logbook as the trains came through. And so what Meakin and Tinsley did, or Meakin, he after 6 a.m., he wrote everything on a separate piece of paper. So when Tinsley clocked in, he could actually transfer that into the logbook. So there was a change of handwriting, and you could see that Tinsley had started work at 6. So the local train obviously can't go into this loop, so it's shunted onto the southbound line. Another express passes through without incident, and the coal train and the troop train are on their way in. Either Tinsley or Meakin should have notified Kirkpatrick's signal box and not accepted the troop train, and this didn't happen. Tinsley's writing up his notes, and at one point, somebody said he just sat there reading notes. Meakin's reading Meakin's reading the newspaper. Hutchison and the drivers of the goods trains are socialising. Again, another contravention of regulations. Only the one signalman is supposed to be in the box. Everyone else is supposed to come in, sign in, do whatever they're supposed to do, and depart. They're not supposed to be chatting. They're not supposed to be reading the newspaper. And you've got this additional question of who was actually on shift, whose responsibility was it? Was it Meakin? Was it Tinsley? So the coal trains moved into the loop, and at 6:49, the troop trains run straight into the local train, headlong, which is sat on the southbound track. And then at this point, the Glasgow Express train's heading into Quintinshill Junction. So a signal needs to be sent to Gretna to stop this northbound express. But by now, Tinsley seems to be utterly paralysed with indecision of what to do, no idea what to do. The guard of the local train, he's managed to jump clear and survive the crash, he runs down the northbound track, waving a flag, trying to stop the express train. Driver express trains pressing the brakes as best he can, but too little too late. And express train plows straight into the wreckage of the troop train and the local train. And that resulting fire that I spoke about, that engulfs all 5 trains. So what you've had here is, in quite a short time period, you've had 7 trains. 2 have gone through that incident, and then these 5. And that is something needed careful management, and not Meakin and Tinsley, who were obviously pretty much just at it, and not really doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's there. We'll let that run again just to. This is a drawing that was from one of the inquiries after the event, and the green train here is the troop train, spread pretty much over the 4 tracks, the crash site, the debris everywhere. So, breaches of regulations. First one, the unofficial change to working patterns that Meakin and Tinsley were employing, with Tinsley starting late. This was not approved. This was not known about by their managers, boss, whatever. They were not allowed to do this. Secondly, Tinsley faking the entries on the register. Tinsley coming to work on a local train and hopping off onto the line. He was not allowed to do this. With the local train came in, it could stop, it could be on a siding, it could be shunted, but only either the driver or the fireman was allowed off the train to the signal box to clock in or to check in. Passengers and anybody else were not allowed to get off the train, because of you couldn't just have people wandering around over a railway. So another breach of regulation. Too many people chatting in the signal box when they should have returned to their trains. The drivers of the freight train should have gone in, logged in, and then returned to their trains, as should Hutchison. And Meakin should have gone home. He should not have been there either. Failure to implement the correct signalling procedures. The troop train should not have been allowed through. And when the accident did happen, first accident happened, express trains should not have been allowed through. Failure to implement what was called Rule 55. This one I'll come back to in a minute, but it's basically Hutchison, as the fireman on the local train. What he should have done is gone into the signal box, checked in with with either Tinsley or Meakin, whoever was on duty, made sure that they were aware that his train was shunted onto the line, and he was also supposed to make sure there was a collar put over the lever, the signal lever, which I'll show you in a bit. And then there was this, maybe not breach of regulation, but forgetfulness, competence. Tinsley had forgotten Meakin's instruction to send the local train onto Kirkpatrick after, between the express trains. It shouldn't have, it was shunted onto the other track, but it shouldn't have been left there. As soon as the first express train went through, it should have been brought back. Tinsley forgot about the local train on the track. That was the train he'd come to work in, and he forgot it was there. And he didn't even appear to notice that when Hutchison had come in, he'd signed the wrong page of the book. So it's fair to say Tinsley was not on top of his game that day. And this here, Rule 55. Hutchison was supposed to come in, report into Tinsley, and then they would should put on this wooden collar over the signal lever, which acts as a reminder that you cannot pull this lever down. That part of the railway is blocked by a train. This didn't happen. And actually, one of the things that came out in the inquiries subsequently is that these kind of things were ignored just as, Tinsley and Meakin were getting away with changing their working hours. The These collars were not being put on. There was various, so many sort of slip ups in good working practices. And Tinsley, when the line he stuck to throughout all the inquiries, when he was arrested, everything, he forgot about the train. And this, yeah, as I said, it is the train he came to work on. How could he have forgotten about it? So this may shed a bit of light on things. When they went to arrest Tinsley, the policeman recorded that he'd fallen down in an epileptic fit. Now, this is a letter from his doctor confirming that he'd fallen down in an epileptic fit as a result of what had happened, the stress of it. But I think it's pretty well known that epilepsy isn't caused, it's not caused by stress. So it's possible that Tinsley suffered from epilepsy, which makes being a signalman probably not the ideal work occupation for him, for everybody's safety. If he was, and there's a possibility if he was epileptic, maybe he'd had an epileptic fit the night before or earlier that morning and was still unwell from it. Or maybe there's, I can't remember the exact name of it, but there's a form of epilepsy. It's not epileptic fit, but you kind of check out a while, you're just not there. So I'm not quite sure what the exact name of it is, but either way, something was not quite right with Tinsley. And the inevitable inquiries. First of all, Board of Trade inquiry that was held almost immediately afterwards and fully put the blame on Tinsley Meakin. But it did raise issues with the railway practices, the construction of carriages, lack of firefighting equipment, the lighting system, the gas. And as a result, were quite far-reaching changes to railway safety. These were implemented from this. Then there was the Carlisle's coroner inquiry, because so many of the men were taken to Carlisle. Men died in hospital in Carlisle, so they decided it was to be an inquiry there. Again, Tinsley and Meakin were blamed, but also culpable were Hutchison and Thorburn. And they wanted to try Tinsley, Meakin, and Hutchison for manslaughter. Thorburn was the station master at Gretna, and this is the station where Tinsley got onto the train that he shouldn't have been on. So the inquiry implied that Thorburn should have either did know about it and turned a blind eye, or if he didn't know about it, then he should have known. So he was equally culpable. Then the High Court trial, September 1915. There was, because it was just on the border, England, Scotland, the legal brains in England met with the legal brains in Scotland, and it was decided that the trial would be held in Scotland. So, and it was a sellout event. A huge crowd wanted to come and see this. Tinsley had already been charged with culpable homicide, which I think is the equivalent of manslaughter. Unfortunately for Tinsley and Meakin, the prosecution were very well represented. There was only Caledonian railway officials called to give evidence. There were no independent verification or anything like that. So that certainly did not play in Meakin and Tinsley's favour, who were both sentenced to prison. Tinsley 3 years, Meakin 18 months. Hutchison found not guilty, and both Hutchison and Thorburn removed from their posts, lost their jobs. Then there was a public inquiry. That did come to the conclusion that there should have been a stronger line taken against the railway company. I mean, I suppose technically maybe it is corporate manslaughter. I don't know, but ultimately it did reach the same conclusion that Meakin and Tinsley were wholly to blame. And then, interestingly, the Caledonian Railway's own internal inquiry. This was low key. This was held in private, and it did the records of it did note that More regular inspections were required. There was a lack of staff supervision. When they did carry out inspections, what they needed to do was inspect at the changeover at 6 a.m. to make sure handover was done correctly, rather than the way Meakin and Tinsley had come to their own working arrangements. It also concluded the signal procedures should needed tightened up. These collars, safety collars, should be used on the levers. There's no excuse that a signal couldn't get through to Gretna to stop the express train, and why wasn't the signal sent to not accept the troop train when there was a local train already on the track. So there was a lot came out of that. But yeah, as you'd expect, no prosecutions. The issue of Tinsley's health just seems to be forgotten by all. So there was no mention of that. But would the company admit that they'd employed a man to do this job, a man with epilepsy to do this job? It doesn't show them in a terribly good light. And then there are their appeals. Tinsley served, he went to Peterhead Prison, which the logic of which defeats me. I don't know why Peterhead. Initially, he was put on hard labour, but obviously he was not built for that, and soon fell ill. Then he was put on to repairing mail sacks and sewing mail sacks. And from the account seemed to be that he was treated quite leniently. He was even allowed to attend a funeral with a presence with a prison guard with him. Then there was a campaign for their release. MPs in the union were involved, and the papers also took up the call. They wanted to try and blame the railway companies for this, about how much the men had to manage wasn't fair. The number of trains, rules, instructions, and how the railway company should take some account for the fact that these guys could just basically run amok and do whatever they wanted. So, but most importantly, the union was involved, and the one thing that they could not afford at that time was a rail strike in the middle of the war. It just could not happen. So eventually, both were released after about 15 months, and both went back to working for the railway. Meakin as a guard, Tinsley as lampman, Hutchison and Thorburn also went back to working for the railway. Thorburn actually became station master at a bigger station. And while Tinsley was in prison, his family are actually looked up after by the railway, given a house and everything like that. So, conspiracy, is it or isn't it? This book was released in this documentary claiming that it was a conspiracy. I think the main gist of it was that Meakin and Tinsley took the flak to protect the railway companies. I don't know. I think from my perception of it is that, conspiracy, a good old conspiracy is, I was looking at Neil Oliver here, as a man who likes a conspiracy. He's saying there's a new world order as a result of COVID. Now that's a conspiracy. Whereas the railway companies trying to limit their liability, that's just what companies do. So I wouldn't really call it conspiracy. There was also the thought that it was agreed between the railway company and Meakin and Tinsley that they would take the flak in exchange for very light sentences. And again, I'm not sure that that was the case, because when Tinsley was in Peterhead prison, he'd written to the authorities volunteering his services for the front line to get out of prison. Why would you do that if you knew, you're going to get out soon, your family is being looked after, you're going to have your job back? Why would you volunteer for the front line? And anyway, I can just imagine the commanding officer's expression when he receives that application, a man with epilepsy who's already wiped out half the battalion. So, needless to say, his application was turned down. And the memorials there, top ones in Gretna. The plaque here, that is Larbert Station, which is where they boarded the train. There, the one on the bridge there that overlooks the Quintinshill junction, and there's actually a display about it in the Devil's Porridge Museum at Gretna, which talks about that's also takes in the history of the munitions factory and yeah, it's interesting to go to if you've get the chance. Of course, Devil's Porridge, that was the name given to this mixture of cotton nitrates and that put in a big nitration pan as a in you know it's one of the key ingredients in cordite. So this stuff is all mixed together and it's known as the Devil's Porridge. So, footnote, if that wasn't here, the dead. 214 dead, 83 are identified, 82 unidentified, and 50 missing. Two passengers from the local train were killed. Seven passengers from the express train were killed, which possibly gives is testament to its newer construction. It was a steel construction train. It was much newer, so that's possibly why they came off slightly better. Three were railway staff, including Francis Scott, who was the driver of the troop train, and he was very, very well known and respected engine driver. He'd driven royal trains and that, so he had a very big, well-attended funeral in Carlisle. That's 226 accounted for. But what they also found was four bodies of children, and nobody knows why, where, what train they're on. Probably unlikely to have been on the troop train, but they were taken to Glasgow. Attempts were, it was advertised that we'd found, called for families to report missing children to no avail. So they were never ever claimed. So the bodies of these four children lie in Maryhill, lying the Western Necropolis in Glasgow, and nobody's ever know what happened to them. So, but what happened to the rest of the battalion? C and B Company were sent to Gallipoli, and as were the seven officers that were remaining, where they fought. I think they were in action, first of all. I'm going to say, I'm not a Gallipoli expert, I'm going to say 156th Brigade under in 52nd Lowland Division, and they fought here. So I'm going to leave that with you as the final. It's a quiz. Where did they fight? Okay. Clue. Stephen Chambers will be able to tell you. So they were in action here in June at Gallipoli. And that's the end. Thank you very much.